When my boyfriend proposed to me at a class reunion, his first love suddenly appeared. She was wearing the exact same little black dress as I was. Earl, no matter how much of a copy you make, I'm still not her. Earl didn't even glance at her, focusing on sliding the ring onto my left-hand ring finger. Linda, will you marry me? But I could clearly feel his hand trembling slightly as he held mine. I felt a moment of confusion. After 2 years of dating, I had been waiting for this day for so long, but when I opened my mouth, I found I couldn't say the words right away. Seeing I hadn't responded, Earl looked up and gently repeated, Linda. In that moment, his usually calm and steady eyes even showed a hint of vulnerability and pleading. My heart softened immediately. I will. At the same time I spoke those words, Kelly let out a cold laugh, walked over in her high heels, and took a seat without a care. She wore the same little black dress as I did, had the same chestnut-colored long curls, and her lips were bright red, exceptionally beautiful. Her gaze at me was filled with blatant disdain. It was as if she were looking at a knockoff, a substitute. In the frozen atmosphere, it was Earl's class leader who stood up first and clapped, breaking the silence. All right, Earl finally got the proposal done. Let's all have a toast. Done? Kelly smiled brightly and looked over. Earl, do you really think your proposal was a success? Earl coldly replied, it has nothing to do with you. He paused, then sat back down, still holding my hand. Perhaps by coincidence, our seats were directly across from Kelly, and everything she did was clearly visible to me. Kelly picked up her red wine, took a sip, and then leaned toward the man next to her, saying something. Whatever she said, she laughed in a stunning and exaggerated way, her eyes sparkling. Suddenly, I understood why her gaze toward me was so full of contempt. Even though I was dressed just like her, I didn't have the same flirtatious and carefree aura. I lowered my eyes awkwardly and quietly asked Earl, why did you give me this dress? Earl was silent for a moment. Because I think it suits you. Suit me? I opened my mouth to say something, but in the end, I remained silent. For some reason, my mind suddenly drifted back to 2 months ago. Encouraged by my best friend Ivy, I dyed my long hair, which I had kept for many years, a chestnut color and curled it into big waves. The next day, when I went on a date with Earl, I saw a brief flash of confusion in his eyes when he looked at me. Though his gaze was on my face, it felt as though he was looking through me, as if at something else. I quietly asked him, what are you thinking about? Thinking of you, he snapped back to reality, reaching out to gently stroke my hair. It looks really good on you. It suits you. A few days later, Earl gave me this little black dress and a maple red lip gloss. These things were completely different from my usual style of dressing. But when Earl held my waist and buried his face in my shoulder, his voice hoarse as he whispered, Linda, will you wear this for me? I couldn't resist him like that. Actually, Earl is quite a cold person. His female colleagues at work often call him the high mountain flower. Even after we started dating, he mostly remained distant and reserved. We hardly ever kissed, and when we did, it was brief and shallow, like a dragonfly skimming the water. But that day, when I first wore this little black dress and put on the maple red lip gloss, Earl suddenly stood up and walked toward me. I had never seen him act like this. After staring at me for a moment, he lowered his head, grabbed my chin, and kissed me deeply. Linda. Earl's voice brought me back from my memories. I snapped back to the present and saw him carefully peeling a shrimp and placing it in my bowl. A brief flutter in my heart instantly cooled when I saw Kelly across from us. The man beside Kelly, wearing gloves, was carefully helping her crack open a crab. She sat there calmly, raising her alluring eyes and looking at us with a provocative glance. Throughout the meal, Earl took care of me meticulously. But I couldn't feel happy at all. Before we got together, I knew he had a first love named Kelly. They had been together for half a year before they broke up right before graduation. It was said that Kelly wanted to study abroad, and she couldn't handle a long-distance relationship. When Earl and I got together, he had already graduated for 2 years. 2 years should be enough to forget any past relationships, especially one that only lasted for 6 months. That's what I always thought. But today, seeing Kelly, I suddenly realized that maybe Earl had never truly gotten over her. Maybe he had been trying to find Kelly's shadow in me, and when he couldn't, he tried to make me more like her. A sharp pain suddenly shot through my heart. I gripped the table, my fingers turning white with the force. "Excuse me, I'm going to the restroom." "I'll go with you." Earl stood up, intending to walk with me, but Kelly's lazy voice rang out behind us. "Wow, you two really have a great relationship, even going to the restroom together. Why not just tie yourselves together with a rope?" She said this with a mocking laugh, but it was still strangely pleasant. Earl's steps froze, his gaze heavy as he looked at me. I could see emotions flickering in his eyes, but it all eventually settled into an impenetrable darkness. "You go," he said softly. "I'll take you home later. Actually, my appearance is rather plain, and bold colors like this bright lipstick don't really suit me. But since it was a gift from Earl, I wore it often." Standing in front of the restroom mirror, I wiped the lipstick off my lips with a damp tissue. I didn't bring makeup remover, and this matte lip gloss was especially difficult to remove. It took a lot of effort, and my lips stung from the friction. I don't know how long it took, but when I finally got it off, my lips were covered with tiny, bleeding cuts. I gave a wry smile at my disheveled reflection and turned to leave. When I returned, the gathering was over. The door to the private room was ajar, and just as I was about to push it open, I heard Kelly's voice inside. "I heard from the class leader that you never came to any of the reunions in the past few years, but this year, you suddenly show up and propose to your girlfriend. What's this, for my benefit?" My hand tightened silently around the doorknob. A moment later, Earl's voice came, cold and indifferent. "Of course not. Don't flatter yourself." "Flatter myself? Or is it that you can't admit it?" I pushed open the door and caught sight of Kelly leaning forward, giving Earl a quick kiss on the lips. They both turned toward me as they heard the noise. Earl's face paled slightly, but Kelly smiled brightly. She grabbed her bag, walking toward me with calm confidence. As we passed each other, she paused, turned her head, and said in a voice that both Earl and I could hear, "Darling, your fiancé smells really nice." Before I saw Kelly with my own eyes, I had heard Earl's friends mention her. She was the most popular goddess during their college years, and countless boys were infatuated with her. As for her, she was carefree and charming, changing boyfriends as often as changing clothes. Although Earl had only dated her for 6 months, he was already the one who had lasted the longest. She walked past me, and the scent of her perfume, sweet and familiar, wafted toward me. Last month, Earl had given me a bottle exactly the same. A sharp sense of humiliation surged up in my chest, and I instinctively clenched the hand that hung by my side, so tightly that my fingertips turned white. "Linda." When I snapped out of it, Kelly was already gone, and Earl, who had been by the window, had somehow moved in front of me. He carefully reached out his hand, as if wanting to embrace me. I took a step back, avoiding his touch. "You're dirty." I tried my best to make the words sound calm, but there was still a trace of uncontrollable trembling in my voice. At my words, Earl's face instantly turned pale. He raised his hand and began to wipe at the lipstick mark Kelly had left on him, scrubbing at it forcefully, until the skin was covered with tiny scratches and started to bleed. "Is it clean now?" His voice was hoarse as he explained, his dark eyes never leaving mine. "Linda, I really wanted to avoid her, but as soon as she touched me, you walked in. I didn't have time to stop it." I fell silent for a moment before softly asking, "Why did you suddenly propose to me today, at the class reunion?" "I just wanted a classmate to witness for me. Linda, you're the most important person to me now. I want to marry you." I broke up with her 4 years ago. I honestly didn't know she was coming to the reunion today. The things I gave you, they were just because of my personal preferences. I admit, I wanted to tie you to my own aesthetic, but I didn't mean for you to replace her, never did." He spoke sincerely, his gaze steady and unwavering, as if guilt had nothing to do with him. But all I felt was an increasing bitterness in my chest. After a moment, I took a deep breath and said slowly, "Do you know, Earl, we've been together for 2 years, and you've never said anything like this to me before." Earl froze, and his expression slowly became cold. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but in the end, he just closed it dejectedly. In fact, I was only with Earl because of my persistent pursuit. When he first joined the company, his good looks had made many female colleagues take an interest in him, but no matter who invited him to dinner, he never agreed. At the time, I was in charge of a few projects, and since part of it was being handed over to Earl, we naturally had more chances to interact. I invited him to lunch, bought him an extra serving of afternoon tea, and silently left a cup of coffee on his desk when he worked late into the night. On the day the project was successfully delivered, we worked overtime until the early morning. After we got the news, we just grabbed 2 cans of beer from the vending machine downstairs and had a half-hearted celebration. The night breeze was cool, and as I pulled open the beer tab, foam spilled all over my hand. Just when I didn't know what to do, Earl handed me a tissue from beside me. I reached for it, but he didn't let go, gently wiping the foam off my hand, then slowly gripping my fingers. "Linda," he asked softly, "are you chasing me?" I froze, my ears turning slightly red as I replied, "Yes." Even though we had been together for 2 years, I still didn't understand why Earl had agreed to be with me back then. After we got together, he wasn't exactly bad to me, he just didn't talk much and wasn't proactive. I always told myself that's just how he was. But I had overlooked the fact that I, too, could be quiet around others, yet when I was with Earl, I would struggle to find topics to talk about, messaging him about my daily life. Even our first kiss was initiated by me. But it wasn't about personality. It was simply that he didn't love me enough. I told Earl I needed some time to cool down. His lashes fluttered, and he covered the darkness in his eyes. "Let me take you home." "No need." I glanced at the ring on my finger, still intending to take it off and return it to him. "You should keep this for now." Before I could finish, Earl grabbed my hand, his voice hoarse. "You already accepted my proposal. You can't back out now." Pain clearly flashed in his eyes, and as I looked at him, I felt momentarily dazed. Earl, always calm to the point of indifference, was actually feeling hurt for me? By the time we got downstairs, it was completely dark. The restaurant was in a rather secluded area, the streetlights dim, with only a few cars passing by. Earl turned to face me, his tone almost pleading. "I know you're still angry, but it's really not safe at this hour. Let me take you home, okay?" In the end, I agreed. There was no need to joke with my own safety. On the way home, I remained silent, absent-mindedly watching the scenery passing by outside the car window. Instead, Earl kept trying to make conversation, attempting to ease the nearly frozen atmosphere in the car. I listened without speaking until the car stopped at a red light, and suddenly asked, "If Kelly hadn't broken up with you before she left the country, would you two have stayed together?" Earl's hand tightened on the steering wheel. I watched his fingers whiten slightly, and for some reason, I felt a pang in my chest. "Forget it, you don't need to." "No." Earl cut me off and turned to look at me. His eyes were calm, and there was an indifferent finality in them. Even when I was with her, there were always people coming and going around her. I never thought we were from the same world. "But you're different, Linda. You're the only one I ever thought about marrying." He said the last sentence with such sincerity, the light from the car's overhead lamp illuminating his beautiful eyes as though stars had fallen into them. For a moment, my heart softened. When I came back to my senses, I avoided his gaze and said lightly, "The light's green. Drive." A shadow of sorrow crossed Earl's eyes, but he didn't say anything. He silently started the car. Once we got home, he sent me a message, "Remember to put medicine on your lips." "You too," I typed back, but after a moment of hesitation, I deleted it word by word. The next morning, as I was carrying a bag of trash down the stairs, I saw Earl waiting downstairs. He rushed up to me, but froze when he saw what I was holding. I expressionlessly threw the packed black dress and perfume lip gloss into the trash can. When I looked back at Earl, his expression was unreadable. Earl softly said, "Let's go to work together." In the car, I messaged Ivy. Earl came to pick me up for work. She replied with a shocked expression and then asked, "Are you going to forgive him?" "I don't know." I really didn't know. For the next few days, Earl picked me up and dropped me off at work on time, brought me my favorite food during afternoon tea, and tried to make small talk whenever we were alone together. It wasn't that I wasn't soft-hearted, but I kept thinking back to the scene of Earl proposing to me that day. The moment Kelly walked in, his expression changed, and the hand holding mine tightened suddenly. Does he really not care anymore? At the end of the month, the company sent me on a business trip to another city. But on the day I was supposed to return, a sudden downpour hit. The flooded streets paralyzed both transportation and communication, and I was stuck in my hotel room, waiting for a flight back whenever it would be available. However, late the next night, after I lost signal and hung up on Ivy, just as I was about to sleep, there was a sudden, urgent knock on the door. I cautiously walked to the door. "Who is it?" "Linda, it's me." After a brief pause, I quickly opened the door, only to be pulled into a warm, slightly damp embrace. "Earl," I said softly, a bit hoarse. "Why are you here?" His warm palm rested on my head, gently comforting me, one soft stroke at a time. "I arranged to come with a delivery truck," Earl said. "Linda, I was just worried you'd be scared." I was indeed scared. The signal on my phone had been spotty for days, and the whole city was quickly becoming an isolated island, cut off from the world. Although the floodwaters on the streets were gradually receding, the fear in my heart hadn't completely faded. Only now, as I rested in Earl's arms, did my unsettled heart feel a faint glimmer of light. At least, in that moment, I believed I truly mattered to him. After returning, I cut my hair short and switched back to my old shirt and jeans. Earl didn't say anything. He even reached out and touched my short hair, smiling as he complimented me, "So cute." However, just as I was about to forget about Kelly, she suddenly appeared again. That evening after work, Earl and I went downstairs together, and from a distance, I spotted a familiar figure standing by the roadside. It was already the early autumn, and the breeze was cool, yet she was still wearing a well-fitted camisole dress. The wind fluttered her skirt, revealing her slender calves. I felt Earl's arm, which I had linked around mine, stiffen slightly. My heart sank. When she saw us, Kelly walked over gracefully, smiling at Earl and saying, "Earl, I need to talk to you alone." She didn't even glance at me, as if I were just an insignificant passerby. For some reason, I suddenly felt like laughing. "You two talk, I'll go ahead," I said, attempting to pull my arm from Earl's, but he firmly held onto my wrist. He pressed his lips together, glanced at me, and I could see something flickering in his eyes. Then, he turned back to Kelly and said coldly, "If you have something to say, say it here." Kelly's expression froze for a moment, but soon she returned to her usual composed and indifferent self. "Earl," she said, reaching up to tuck her wind-blown hair behind her ear. "I'm getting married." Kelly handed him an invitation, and Earl stared at the prominent ring on her finger for a while, before replying, "Congratulations." He never took the invitation from her hand. Kelly's expression gradually stiffened. Her eyes, like rippling water, darted over to me before she suddenly turned and handed the invitation to me. "Since you're here, you can take it for your boyfriend." I was caught off guard by the invitation being shoved into my hand. Reflexively, I held on to it, but by the time I thought to give it back, Kelly had already turned and walked away. Her dismissive attitude stirred a rare anger in me, and I was about to tear up the invitation when Earl suddenly reached out and took it from my hand. I froze for a moment. "Are you going?" "No." Earl lowered his eyes, avoiding my gaze. "I just think you don't need to get upset over someone insignificant." "Insignificant, huh?" The invitation didn't seem to have affected Earl at all. He was still as considerate as before, his attitude even gentler. But one time, when we were out on a date, he arrived first. When I walked over, I happened to see him resting his chin in his hand, staring vacantly at something not far away. Following his gaze, I saw a couple in the distance. They were probably university students. The guy was tall and upright, while the girl had chestnut-colored curly hair. Her graceful figure looked vaguely familiar. I froze. Until the girl turned her head. It wasn't Kelly. For some reason, I breathed a sigh of relief, and when I turned around, I realized Earl had already come up beside me. He took my bag from my hand and casually asked, "What do you want to eat tonight?" I hesitated for a moment before softly asking, "Are you still thinking about her?" "Who?" "Kelly." Earl suddenly stopped walking and turned to look at me. Behind him, the sky was painted in shades of blood-red sunset, and his handsome face was lit up in a way that made him seem almost fragile. "I was just thinking about my college years. Linda, I wish I had met you back then." He paused, his gaze shifting downward to my ring. "In the past few days, I've contacted my parents. They'll be coming next month. If you can, maybe you could contact your parents too. Linda, let's get married." The meeting between our parents was mostly arranged by Earl. He confirmed the time with my parents, booked a private room at a hotel in advance, and even had me help pick out a bunch of gifts. But my heart felt empty, as if it was caught in midair by something intangible, unable to settle. Ivy asked me, "Have you made up your mind? Are you really going to marry Earl?" In that moment of hesitation, I remembered the afternoon Earl first joined the company. My supervisor asked me to meet with the new project manager, and as I walked into the meeting room, I happened to catch Earl's gaze. It was cool and distant, yet there was a hint of lingering indifference. He stared at me for a couple of seconds, before suddenly lifting the corner of his lips. "Button." I blinked. "What?" "Your shirt button, it's undone." I looked down, my face instantly flushed red, and hurriedly turned sideways to fumble with the button on my chest that had come undone. When I turned back, Earl's expression had already returned to its calm, neutral state. "All right, now we can talk about the project." I think that's when I started liking him. "I've decided," I told Ivy. "If the person I'm marrying is Earl, I'm very willing." Days passed, and the day to meet our parents drew closer. That evening, I went to pick up my parents, and just then I received a call from Ivy. "Linda." Her voice sounded slightly rushed, with a hint of hesitation. "You told me your meeting with Earl's parents would be at a place called Azure Haven, right?" I paused. "Yeah. Why?" "I was passing by there after work, and I saw people putting up wedding wreaths and balloons at the entrance. It had the names of the bride and groom on it, and the bride's name is Kelly." It felt like a thunderclap exploded in my head, and everything went blank. "Linda, are you okay? Do you want me to come over and keep you company?" Ivy's worried voice pulled me back to reality. I realized I'd been biting my lip so hard it was sore. After a long moment, I finally managed to say, "No, I'm fine." Looking at my parents' eager faces, there were some things I just couldn't bring myself to say. The next morning, Earl drove to pick me up. I didn't say a word the entire way. He must have noticed something was off because when we stopped, he asked, "Linda, what's wrong? Are you feeling down?" His expression seemed flawless, but I fluttered my eyelashes and eventually said, "Do you know Kelly is getting married at that hotel today?" He looked at me, pressed his lips together, and his expression suddenly turned serious. I squeezed my palm tightly, trying to stay calm, but my voice still trembled uncontrollably. "Since the proposal last time, to the meeting between both parents today. Earl, what exactly do you think of me? Am I just a tool for you to use to provoke Kelly?" Before I could finish my sentence, Earl suddenly pulled me into his arms. "It's not like that, Linda." His voice faltered for a moment, carried by the wind as it drifted into my ear, his emotions unclear. "I booked this place just because it's the best hotel in the city. As for the timing, I don't know why it coincided with hers. Linda, please believe me. If Ivy had been here today, she would probably have slapped Earl without hesitation and yelled, 'I don't believe a word you say.' But I wasn't Ivy. So, I simply closed my eyes, pushed Earl away, and wearily said, 'Since our parents are both here today, I won't say anything. Let's talk about it later, when we're alone.'" Hearing the word break up, Earl immediately tightened his grip on my fingers. "We won't break up." His tone was firm, almost like a solemn promise, though I wasn't sure who he was making it to. From the parking lot all the way to the private room upstairs, he kept holding my hand, never letting go. When both our parents saw us like this, they all smiled and said, "Young people sure are in love. Since there's no problem between the kids, we should set a wedding date soon." While we were having a pleasant conversation, faint sounds of lively music came from outside. The waiter, looking apologetic, said, "Sorry, there's a wedding being held upstairs today, and they're currently reading their vows." Before he could finish, Earl, sitting next to me, suddenly stood up. I instinctively reached out to grab his sleeve, but he was already out of reach. Under the surprised gaze of both our parents, Earl steadied himself, forcing a smile as he said, "I think I chose the wrong flavor for the soup earlier. I'll go check with the kitchen." He hurriedly walked to the door. Just as he was about to leave, I gently called out behind him, "Earl." I silently warned him, "Don't make this look so bad." Earl paused for a second at the door, but didn't turn back. In that instant, I clearly heard something in my heart shatter. My mom was the first to notice something was wrong. Without saying a word, she moved her chair next to mine and gently took my hand. What's wrong? I only then realized my hand was trembling slightly, and my fingertips were ice cold. Mom. Taking a deep breath, I forced back the tears, steadied myself against the table, and stood up. Earl has been gone for a while. I'm going to see what's going on. It hadn't actually been that long, but every second since he left the room had felt like an eternity, stretching out in the torment inside my chest. I bit my lip and stepped into the elevator, watching the numbers jump from 8 to 9, then the doors opened. The lively atmosphere in the banquet hall suddenly froze. I saw Kelly in a magnificent wedding dress standing on the stage, surrounded by countless flowers. Earl was standing a few steps away from her, looking up at her. He looked like a devout worshipper, gazing at his muse. Her eyes, filled with affection, were locked on Earl, the corners of her eyes glistening with tears, but her lips curled into a smile. She said, "Earl, I knew you'd come to take me away." The entire banquet hall erupted in shock. Clearly, this dramatic wedding crashing scene had stunned everyone. I stepped out of the elevator and walked toward Earl, stopping a few steps behind him, calling out softly. "Earl." He seemed to snap out of a daze, turning abruptly to look at me, still disoriented. "Linda." I took a step back, dodging the hand he reached out to grab my sleeve, and then quietly announced. "Earl, you're free now. We're breaking up." In my mind, I thought I would say these words with cold determination, but as soon as they left my mouth, I realized my voice trembled with barely contained sobs. The sound of the elevator door opening behind me rang out with a soft ding, followed by hurried footsteps approaching. A warm, soft hand landed on my shoulder. The next second, a loud slap rang out across Earl's face. "Can you stop acting like a victim?" Ivy, holding me steady, raised her eyes and sneered at Earl. "Can't stand to let go? But your true love is still standing on the stage waiting for you. Look at her, she looks so pathetic. If you picked up a pull tab off the floor, I'm sure she'd marry you. Aren't you going to hurry up and go?" Saying that, she pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of Earl and Kelly. "Come on, hurry up with the vows. I'll capture this beautiful moment for you too, and post it online. Next year on Valentine's Day, no need to go to the movies, just watch you two playing out your love story right here." Kelly's face turned pale, while Earl didn't look at her even once. Instead, he focused all his attention on me, his expression fragile, as though he would shatter if touched. "I'm sorry, Linda." He apologized to me. I just what? Couldn't resist? One last time? I took a deep breath, exhaling slowly, and looked at him with indifference. "Earl, you disgust me." His handsome face instantly drained of color, turning deathly pale. But I didn't feel relieved. The chaotic memories of the past 2 years replayed in my mind, and in the end, they shattered into dust. I turned away, linked my arm with Ivy's, and walked out. Earl called my name from behind, "Linda." I never looked back. Not once. After walking all the way to the lobby on the first floor, the suffocating tension in my chest finally began to ease. I turned to Ivy. "How did you get here?" She reached out and touched the tips of my hair, her voice gentle. "I was worried you wouldn't be able to handle that couple on your own." The tears I had been holding back finally fell when I heard her words. Since high school, Ivy had always been my protector. I'm naturally introverted and quiet, and whenever someone bullied me, it was always Ivy who stepped in and fought back. Not long after I started dating Earl, I introduced him to Ivy. Back then, she confidently extended her hand to him, shook it, and smiled, saying, "Do you see this hand? If you ever hurt Linda, this hand will turn into a slap on your face." I never thought her words would come true. Ivy straightened my clothes and waited for the suffocating emotions to slowly settle. Then I remembered I should tell my parents. When I called, I could faintly hear some noise on the other end, followed by my dad's angry voice. Forget it, no wedding." It wasn't until later that I learned they had been waiting for me and Earl for a long time. With the help of a waiter, they had gone upstairs and accidentally walked into the scene where Earl was holding Kelly's hand and walking down from the stage together. Kelly's original fiancé looked at them with cold eyes and said, "What do you think you're doing? Kelly, are you calling off the wedding?" She turned around with a disdainful look in her eyes, saying, "You were the one pressuring me to marry him. I never wanted to get married in the first place." Later, Ivy, who was holding my arm, ran into them in the lobby. My parents, still clearly angry, walked ahead. Earl's parents rushed to follow and explain, while Kelly, in her wedding dress, was walking at the back, practically glued to his arm. It was more dramatic than any TV show. My dad walked over to my side, and when he saw Ivy, his expression softened a little. Ivy took the opportunity to say, "I drove here. Let's go." Parents-in-law. My mom suddenly turned around, pointing at Earl and scolding him sharply. "Who are your in-laws? Take care of your own son first. If he likes these shady women so much, why is he trying to ruin our decent family's daughter?" It was total chaos. In the middle of all this, I quietly looked up at Earl. He opened his mouth as if just realizing what was going on. "Linda." He called my name. I didn't respond immediately, just looked past his shoulder to meet Kelly's beautiful, almost unreal face and her provoking, smug gaze. It was as if she was saying, "See? No matter how hard you try, as long as I snap my fingers, your boyfriend will leave you without a second thought and come straight to me." Yes, she was always the winner. But I never had any interest in competing with her. I calmly looked at Kelly and mouthed, "He's all yours." Earl was still trying to explain. Kelly's family forced her to get married to a useless playboy. I just wanted to help her one last time. I nodded, then spoke in a tone colder than I expected. "Help all you want. We're already broken up. Even if you help her for the rest of your life, it doesn't matter." Earl's once clear eyes now swirled with dark emotions, and in the end, they seemed to settle into a shadow that wouldn't go away. He bit his lip, his voice hoarse as he asked, "You really won't forgive me, will you?" I suddenly felt exhausted. I raised my hand to rub my temples, then told him. "I haven't not forgiven you, Earl. I just don't love you anymore." In fact, walking away from this relationship was easier than I had imagined. Maybe it was because, at that moment in Kelly's wedding, when I saw Earl, I finally admitted to myself that he cared about Kelly far more than he ever cared about me. Even though I was his girlfriend at the time, and even though Kelly had been involved with other men back then, even though he had found me in a city isolated by a storm and held me tight. People fear comparisons. I had been lying to myself, thinking he was good to me too, until the truth cut through my heart like a sharp blade. I finally admitted that if he had to choose between me and Kelly, he would walk straight to her without hesitation. I took 3 days off to rest at home, and when I returned to work, I noticed my colleagues looking at me strangely, as if they had something to say but weren't sure how to bring it up. It wasn't until Ivy sent me a video link that I understood why. Someone had recorded the scene at Kelly's wedding and posted it online. The absurd and ridiculous love-hate entanglements had been exposed for all to see: Kelly, tearfully standing on stage, her cold-eyed fiancé, and Earl, who appeared almost like a savior to her. I, standing in the corner, was nothing more than an insignificant background character. At lunch that day, Earl sat down across from me with a tray. I looked up at him, paused for a moment, swallowed the bite of food in my mouth, and picked up my bowl as if to leave. "Linda." He stopped me, his voice cautious and tentative. "I've already contacted the person who uploaded the video, and it's been taken down. That was Kelly's idea to escape her fiancé, not mine." I suddenly turned my head to face him, expressionless. "Are you done?" Earl looked at me, and the light in his eyes dimmed inch by inch. For a moment, I almost thought he was going to cry. She came to me crying, saying her family's business was in trouble. Her parents forced her to marry a rich, uncultured man to solve their financial problems. I told her that was the last time I would help her. "Linda, I never lied to you. I just wanted to marry you." I stood there, quietly listening to him. We were in a quiet corner of the company cafeteria, with hardly anyone walking by. It felt like an invisible force was isolating us from the rest of the world. After Earl finished explaining, he saw that I still seemed indifferent. His face suddenly twisted in pain. "Linda, can we start over?" His eyes were as clear as before, and when I looked into them, I saw my own reflection clearly staring back. But it no longer mattered. "Earl, I don't want you anymore." I finally spoke, calmly. "I've already submitted my resignation. It's been approved." Earl froze, his body stiffened. After a moment, with tears welling in his eyes, he asked, "Will you ever come back?" I turned and left without answering. I spent the next 2 weeks handing over my projects to others and packing my things, planning to go home for a while. On the day I left, Ivy said she was coming to see me off, but when she showed up, she was carrying a suitcase. When I asked her about it, she smiled and ruffled my hair, her eyes sparkling with a bit of mischief. "I took some time off to come with you. I was worried you might feel down on your own, and your parents are working, so they can't always be with you." The plane flew through the clouds and sunlight, landing at the airport, near my hometown. When I returned home, Ivy naturally moved in with me. I didn't tell my mom I was coming back. Otherwise, she'd set me up with blind dates again. That night, we lay on my bed, just like when we were in school, heads touching, whispering to each other. I never told you this, but the last time I came back, just for 3 days, my mom set up 4 blind dates, and not a single decent person. The night light by the bed cast a soft, warm glow, and I looked at her face, lit by it, as she playfully complained. I couldn't help but laugh. She pouted, accusing me, "You're making fun of me." I hugged the stuffed bear she gave me 8 years ago and smiled at her. "Well, your mom has a point. You've been single for so long, it's only natural for her to worry. When you bring a boyfriend home, I'm sure she'll stop pushing you for blind dates. I have someone I like." Ivy fell silent for a moment before suddenly speaking up. I was a bit surprised, unable to stop myself from sitting up and looking at her. "Really? Who? Have I met him?" She looked into my eyes in the dim light, and after a moment, smiled brightly, more dazzling than the glow around us. "It's a secret." Ivy and I had stayed at home for a long time, visiting many places we loved going to when we were in school. Memories came flooding back, bringing with them countless chaotic yet deep moments. The scars from that past failed relationship were gradually being healed. That evening, the air was cool and damp. Ivy and I sat down at a barbecue stall we used to frequent. But we had barely eaten 2 bites when a few drunk men from the table next to us suddenly gathered around, shouting and asking for our contact information. Ivy immediately shielded me behind her, looking up at them coldly. "No. If you're drunk, go home and look for your mom. Stop causing a scene in front of strangers." The men became furious and reached out to touch us. "Get away." Ivy raised her hand to block them, and the faint light from the overhead lamp shimmered, casting ripples of light across her hair. It was then that Earl appeared. He swiftly grabbed the hand that was about to reach me and forcefully pushed the man to the ground before getting into a fight with a few of them. After the initial panic and surprise, I pinched my palm to calm myself down, then quickly called the police. By the time we finished the police report and came out of the station, it was already late at night. Earl's actions were deemed as heroism, and the drunk men who had harassed Ivy and me were locked up in the detention room, to be kept there for another 14 days after sobering up. Under the street lamp, I noticed that Earl's hand was starting to bleed. After a moment's hesitation, I reminded him. "You're wound, you should get it treated at a hospital soon." He didn't respond. It had been half a month since we last saw each other. He had lost some weight, and his hair had grown long without being cut. He looked more disheveled than the cold and indifferent man I remembered. He was still charming, though. But there was no stir in my heart. Ivy's icy voice suddenly broke the silence. "How did you suddenly show up there? I've been feeling like someone's been secretly following us since this morning." "It was you, wasn't it?" Earl still didn't speak, just standing there, silently gazing at me with longing. I didn't feel touched, nor did I feel disgusted. All I felt was a deep sense of calm and indifference. In that moment, I truly realized that I no longer liked him. "Thanks for saving me tonight," I said softly. "If you need, I'll cover the medical expenses for your hand." Earl's eyelashes fluttered for a moment before he finally spoke. "I just wanted to see you again." What was there left to see? I didn't understand. "Since we've already broken up completely, you might as well go back to Kelly. She's probably your ideal type, isn't she?" I continued. "I've never been proactive about anything in my life. When I pursued you, it was because I really liked you at the time, so I threw away my pride and shyness, and tried my best to express my feelings." He opened his mouth as if to say something, but I interrupted him. "Our 2 years together were pretty dull. You didn't like talking to me, and most of the topics I tried to bring up were boring. Earl, I know you've always wanted me to become someone like Kelly, but that's impossible. Even if I wore the same dress as hers, used the same lipstick and perfume, I still could never be her. When you proposed to me, even though I knew we were meeting parents at the same hotel where Kelly's wedding was, I truly wanted to marry you. But now, I really don't like you anymore. In fact, when I saw him, I instinctively felt disgusted. Because that face, which used to make my heart flutter, no longer reminded me of all the romantic details from the past, but only of the awkwardness at Kelly's wedding. Pain and regret stirred up a huge storm in his eyes. After a moment, it seemed to sweep everything away, leaving only silence. A sense of defeat spread, and for that instant, I felt like something inside Earl had emptied out and could never be filled again. Days passed after Earl left, and I received a call from an unknown number. It was Kelly. In her usual haughty tone, she questioned me. It's strange. How could I lose to you? What do you have that Earl would choose you in the end? I couldn't help but laugh. That's between you and him. What's that got to do with me? She fell silent for a while before saying, I'm married. Oh, congratulations. Not to Earl. I was speechless for a moment. Her voice came through again. I've dated many men, but Earl was the most special. Because while so many others can't forget me after we break up, only he could move on so quickly and find a new girlfriend, even planning to marry you. Your looks, family background, education, none of these compare to mine. Why did he give up on me for you? That's a question you should ask Earl. I had completely lost patience and was about to hang up when Ivy suddenly grabbed the phone from me. Girl, you're married now, and you still have time to question your ex's ex. If you're so free, why don't you go shovel some manure at your village? All this love drama isn't healthy, at least you'd be doing something useful for society and the people. She didn't even let Kelly respond and hung up the phone, immediately blocking her number. I looked at her and, for some reason, really wanted to laugh. Ivy glanced at me for a moment, then suddenly reached out and pinched my cheek. If you want to laugh, then laugh. I'm just standing up for you. She said this, rolling her eyes. I think this woman's out of her mind. She has some psychological issues. She always wants others to still think about her after a breakup. What's she, some kind of treasure? Maybe because she's pretty. Ivy suddenly leaned in close, looking me over from left to right, and finally concluded. Pretty? She's all right, but honestly, I think you're more beautiful than her. That curly hair of yours before didn't suit you, but now, with your hair like this, you look like a natural beauty. Don't be too pretty. As she said this, her long, slender fingers gently twirled a lock of my short hair, her eyes sparkling. I hadn't cut my hair in a while, and what was once ear length was now almost at my shoulders, the same style I had in high school. I smiled. You're lying, that curly hair was your idea. Without hesitation, Ivy replied, I must have been blind back then. Seeing my speechless expression, she laughed even more, her eyes turning into crescent moons. After dinner, we walked slowly back along the cool autumn street lined with phoenix trees, when we coincidentally passed two high school girls wearing uniforms, walking hand in hand beside us. Ivy suddenly stopped, turned to look at them. After a moment, she turned back to face me, staring at me earnestly. Linda, will we be lifelong friends? For a brief second, I thought I saw a fleeting tear in her eyes. But when I looked again, it was gone, replaced by the usual gentleness. I nodded firmly. Of course we will. Then next time you start a relationship, make sure to let me know so I can help you keep an eye on it. Okay. At New Year's, help me talk to my mom. I really don't want to get married. That night, the moonlight was especially soft. We talked all the way home. And,